Go. Getting ready. Good evening and welcome once again to In the Rabbi's Study. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein and this is Valley Beth Shalom live and online. Tonight in the Rabbi's Study, we're going to be talking about at least the most visible social problem here in Los Angeles, the problem of homelessness. I don't think there's a corner of the city that you can visit where you won't find somebody, a family, a community living under an overpass, beside a park or a bridge. And of course, there are many, many, many blocks of the downtown area that are crowded with tents and carts, a whole community of the homeless living in our city. I'm told that we are the national capital of homelessness, but tonight we're going to welcome some guests who can help us understand that. Please welcome tonight Stephanie Klasky-Gamer, who is the president and CEO of LA Family Housing, one of the leading agencies dealing with this problem and trying to find solutions. Welcome, Stephanie. It's good to have you with us.
Thank you.
And Molly Rysman, who is the deputy for homelessness for Supervisor Sheila Kuehl in the 3rd Supervisor District and deals with this issue directly. Thank you. Welcome, Molly. And
my pleasure being here.
My partner, Rabbi Noah Farkas, when he's not playing a rabbi at Valley Beth Shalom, he is one of the leaders in the County Commission on Homelessness and Housing. Welcome, Noah. It's great to have you here.
Good to see you again, Rabbi.
Thank you. Nice to see you too, Rabbi. Great. Molly, let's begin with the political part of this and sort of an overview of the issue. We see homelessness. We hear numbers and statistics. How bad a problem is it? And is it getting better or worse?
So we have about roughly 60,000 people experiencing homelessness on any given night in Los Angeles. And that ranges from folks who are families to people who are young adults to people who are single adults. So it's a very diverse population who are experiencing homelessness. And it's hard to say about whether it's getting worse or whether it's getting better. We're doing a great job of getting people into permanent housing, but we have a lot of people who are falling into homelessness. So as we transition people into permanent housing, we see new people falling into homelessness, which has led to slight increases over the past few years.
Thank you. Stephanie, I've driven around the city and seen projects with the name LA Family Housing on them. Tell us something about what LA Family Housing does and how they've addressed this issue.
So LA Family Housing has been around, rooted in the San Fernando Valley with VBS for the past 36 years. We are not only a homeless service provider doing street outreach, engagement, helping people with case management move into permanent housing and then stay stable and successful in their housing, but we're also a real estate development company. So we've developed, own, and operate 27 apartment buildings. We have 2 more under construction now, as well as 2 more sites of interim or bridge housing under construction. So if you see LA Family Housing's name around, thank you. I'm glad you do. And I'm glad that you're seeing our beautiful buildings. But what's most important in terms of our work are the people living inside and those who have yet to move inside of any of our properties. That's what we do.
Let me ask both of you this question. I mean, and I apologize for being naive, but I want to get to the bottom of this. Why is there a housing problem? Is there simply not enough housing stock? Is the housing too expensive? Are these people who are mentally ill or drug addicts and don't want housing? Why does this problem exist?
So this is primarily a housing issue, and it's a really complicated issue because the housing crisis is caused by numerous different factors. One is that there isn't enough supply. There's no question, all of the studies show that we're not adding enough housing for how fast our population is growing. And as that supply issue worsens, we find that more and more people can't afford housing. And what's happened over a period of about 20 years is there's become this incredible disconnect between the incomes people make and how much it costs to afford both to rent a home or to buy a home. And it's become harder and harder for a lot of people. And we've also seen a financialization of the housing market that's made it even more difficult as the housing market is driven by larger and larger financial institutions and corporations instead of it being the mom and pop landlord who's, got one or two apartments or a couple different apartment buildings. We're seeing these larger and larger players funded by global capital who, operate in a very different way than the traditional mom and pop landlord. So it's a complicated issue. And unfortunately, what we see is that as it becomes harder for people to afford housing, the people who have the hardest time are the ones who are most marginalized. So there is a very large role that racism plays in this. This does not affect everyone equally. And we have a long history in this country of pushing people of color out of communities. And so they are impacted in a much larger way than people who are white and might have an easier time. And of course, people with disabilities, whether that's mental health or whether that's substance abuse or chronic health conditions. We see a lot of people who are homeless because of medical expenses and chronic disease that prevents them from being able to work. So it's the most vulnerable people in our community who feel the housing crisis most acutely, and it has the deepest impact on them.
Stephanie, what does it take to house somebody? I mean, what are the steps one has to go through in order to get somebody into a domicile, into a house? What is this transition that you spoke about?
So it's a great question. And I think everybody's path into permanent housing looks different. For a veteran who was discharged with a non-dishonorable discharge, meaning maybe they just didn't fit in with their team and they were discharged and so they're not eligible for mental health benefits from the VA, their path might look really different than a young family with two working parents, but they're earning such low wages that they can't afford a typical apartment in Los Angeles, to somebody who's suffered from mental illness earlier in their life, and it went untreated for so many years that they went to self-medicate, which became a substance use disorder, which left them unemployed and on the street and therefore medically vulnerable. Each of their paths are different. But I would say at the core for all of those individuals and those households and those families and those kids is building a connection and building trust. And when you have that connection and that trust, which is something we at LA Family Housing, but all of our colleagues working in this space really focus on, when you have that trust, you can start charting that path into permanent housing for that individual and that family. And so it's not a simple answer, what does it take? It's not just, oh, there's an available unit and there's a person that needs it. That person might not be ready to move in yet, but at my core, and why I think we all wake up every day, I don't believe there's a soul that chooses to be outside. I think they're not ready yet, in the words of Martin Buber.
And I just want to add to that, if I can, because I think that's something a lot of folks don't understand, is why that trust building is so important. A lot of people who we're working with who are experiencing homelessness have had institutions fail them in the past, whether it's somebody who experienced the foster care system as a young adult or as a child, or somebody who was in the military and had a bad experience when they were being discharged from the military, or people who've been in the criminal justice system or who have incurred horrible debt from medical bills in the healthcare system. A lot of our folks have experienced system failures. And so they are very leery when we first approach them. And sometimes people describe that as being service resistant. But what I think anyone who's spent a lot of time with people who've experienced homelessness learns is that it's not that people don't want help. They don't believe that you're coming to them with an authentic offer of help. And honestly, most of the time with what we are coming to them, you have to jump through an incredible number of hoops to get assistance. And it's not because Stephanie is not doing everything she can to make it as easy as possible. Our systems are set up to make it very difficult. If you want to get housing assistance, you need an endless amount of paperwork completed, and completed in a certain sequence, in a certain timing. If you submit one thing and the next thing's 30 days later, the first thing you submitted expires. So it's very complicated to get help. And that's why people are sometimes leery of working with us, is because our system has failed them. We sometimes say that we have a system that is people resistant, not that we have people who are service resistant. And it's one of the reasons why the work Stephanie's team does is so important, that trust building, so people will go through these difficult steps with us.
Noah, I want you to help us understand one more level of this. I think that most of us who walk the streets of this city and see homeless people tend to push them off and think of them as some sort of other species of animal. They're certainly not of our world. And I know that that's ethically very, very questionable. But on the other hand, I mean, I think of myself, I've spent my entire life in a home of one sort or another, whether it was the home I grew up in or the college dorm I lived in or the hotel I visit on vacation. And I can't imagine what it's like to be homeless. Tell us for a moment, what's it like to be homeless? What does the life of a homeless person feel like? What does it look like? What attends that kind of life?
I appreciate the question a lot because a failure of our own imagination, I think, is part of the ethical challenge, that we don't know what it's like to be them. So let me begin by having you imagine a scenario with me, okay? Imagine walking through life with a backpack. And in that backpack, you have everything you need for a day, okay? Whether it's food, water, money, whatever it is, okay? And now put in that backpack anything else that you might need for the rest of your life. Passport, birth certificate, family photos, mementos. All right, so if you're walking with me and you're in that path with me, now imagine that you can never, ever, ever put that backpack down. Because if you put that backpack down, someone's going to steal it. You can't put it down to use the bathroom. Can't you put it down to get something to eat or to take a shower, to do laundry? So the first thing I want to say about homelessness is that there is this sense of dislocation that you can never put stuff down. So you're naturally going to be on your guard. You're going to feel like there's no place that feels safe to you. And especially if you're a person of color, or you're a woman, or someone who is transgender, or youth. So that's the first thing. Now add in another layer. It's amazing to me that through this process, Eddie, as you said, it's hard to imagine who they are. That process leads to an objectification of who they are, and they feel it. Imagine going through your entire life, and imagine that you go through your entire life and no one smiles at you, looks you in the face, acknowledges your existence. Nobody knows your name. And what that does to a human being is that it creates a sense of self-isolation. It's almost as if you've been put in solitary confinement in the greater world. We have a word for this, Eddie. You know this because from our rabbinic literature. It's called cherem. It's what happens when you excommunicate someone. You're not allowed to talk to them, do business with them. It is a form of corporal punishment. And that's what it's like to be homeless. So not only do you have no place to put stuff down, you live in a world where no one even acknowledges your existence. And what that does to a human being is that it deteriorates your sense of self and your sense of worth and even your soul. You dislocate yourself and you become the very thing that you're afraid to become because you yourself have been so forgotten. And so the people I've met who are homeless, who are, especially people who are formerly homeless, go talk about this process. And so what it's like to be homeless is to feel alone in a crowd of people. What it's like to be homeless is never to feel safe. Most people end up on the streets because of some kind of trauma, whether they were abused or they came out to their parents and their parents kicked them out of the house, or they were a foster care kid and when they got old enough, their foster parents no longer received assistance from the government, so they kicked them out. Or they were incarcerated and there was no one there to pick them up at the bus stop when they got out of jail. These are the folks who end up homeless, and they start out like you and me. And they end up in this twice, 3 times, 4 times traumatized place. Which is why when Stephanie talks about that they're not ready to go back into housing is because they're completely coming from a place of trauma. And if we remember that instead of looking at that scary, disheveled looking person sitting in the corner as a violent criminal who might have it out for you, and look at them as a victim of society's trauma, I think it might change your perspective on how to relate to someone who's homeless.
For all of you, I want to ask this question again, and I apologize for my naivete, but I remember a couple of years ago, there was a ballot measure that added a tax surplus, a surtax of some sort. I think it was countywide, in order to address the homelessness problems. And I imagine that raised a good deal of money. So the question is this just a question of money? I mean, if we threw enough billions of dollars at this, would it go away? Or is this a problem that is deeper than just a question of having sufficient funds?
So,
Please.
You want to start, Stephanie?
I'll let Molly kind of speak to some of the mechanics, but I want to speak to the impact. Homelessness is certainly an issue that responds to resources, and we see it. We see it all the time. So what you're referring to is in November of 16, the city of LA passed a measure called Triple H, and that provided capital funds to build permanent supportive housing, to build apartments. And then in March of 17, the county passed the sales tax measure H that you're referring to, which was a quarter cent sales tax that primarily funds the services that we provide across the county to address homelessness. And we've seen incredible impact when those resources flooded our system. And what we've been able to do in many ways, I started saying this 2 months ago as COVID hit our lives, we were prepared for this. We were not prepared for the magnitude of what's happening across the world, but our system was prepared to stand up and respond quickly. And I think it's because we made an investment of those Measure H funds, and we had housing in production because of the city's Triple H funds. Molly, do you want to speak about dollars and mechanics?
Well, I mean, before I talk about dollars and mechanics, I just want to say we have to recognize homelessness doesn't exist in the way it does in America and most of the Western world. And that's not because American people are different or because we have higher rates of mental health or drug abuse, because we don't. That isn't the reason that homelessness is much more prevalent in the United States than other countries. It's because we look at support we provide people very differently. I was lucky enough to spend some time last year in Finland, where housing is a human right, that they believe their citizens are entitled to a place to live, and if they can't afford a place to live, it is up to the government to figure out a way to support them. And the fascinating thing about that is that what that looks like is that most people in Finland will use affordable housing at some point in their life, most often when they are in college or right out of college, and when they're seniors, because they can't afford market rate housing because you don't have as much income when you're at those 2 points in your life. So it's very common for folks to utilize what they call social housing, but what we would call affordable housing here. And for people who are disabled, there's a greater level of assistance, recognizing that they may need a higher level of support than just somebody whose income isn't enough to pay rent. So we have structured our system so that there is not the support that people need. For example, only 1 in 4 people who qualify for housing assistance in America get it. It's one of the few benefits that we ration instead of provide as an entitlement. If we tomorrow made the Section 8 program an entitlement, you would dramatically see homelessness go away very quickly, because this is very much a dollar and cents issue. I do think that said, there are structural issues in our society that also make it very complicated. And that if we truly want no one to be homeless, we do have to address racism and white supremacy and the impacts that has on where we provide housing, how we provide housing, because it would not be enough to just build tons of housing in communities that don't provide the amenities any of us, any basic person would want. We want our children to have access to a decent education. We want to be able to walk down the street safely. And a lot of times, who has access to those communities where there is decent education and you can walk down the street without fear of violence, often is correlated with our ideas about race. So I do think we have deeper issues. It's not just a dollar and cents issue, but the dollars and cents make a huge difference. And so when the city passed Proposition Triple H and the county passed Measure H, the quarter-cent sales tax, they have had a tremendous impact. And we are housing thousands of more people today than we were prior to 2016. Those ballot measures have made a big difference, and they've, like Stephanie said, built up our infrastructure so that we're much stronger and able to respond much quicker to things like COVID-19.
Can I add one thing? So I was actually at VBS must have been the summer of 16, when we were all doing lots of community meetings to introduce Triple H and H to our communities, to our constituents. And I was on a panel with Councilmember Mike Bonin, and we were talking about Triple H, the city measure. And at the end of that panel, and there were maybe 50 people there, a staffer from the councilman's office walked up to me to introduce herself to me. Hi, Stephanie. My name is Magali Flores, and 15 years ago, LA Family Housing saved my family's life. That's a nice way to stop somebody in their tracks. And we're in the hallway, outside of Lapati Chapel, and she says this to me. And, so I asked her what her story was. And this is going back a little bit to the earlier question you asked Noah about what does someone who experiences homelessness look like, feel like, what's their life like? So for many children experiencing homelessness, they don't realize that they're homeless in some ways. There's something beautiful that their parents have done by creating a loving, nurturing environment, even if it's in somebody's converted garage with 2 working parents and 5 kids. And that's how Magali grew up. And when her parents put in an application for an affordable housing unit in Van Nuys, her parents applied and they were granted that apartment, and that was one of LA Family Housing's properties, and they still live there to this day. And how Magali describes it is, one, they didn't realize they were homeless, and they didn't like leaving, the home that they were in to move into this 3-bedroom apartment for the 7 of them to live. But she said the relief, the pressure of moving into housing gave them a chance to not just survive, but to start dreaming. And all 5 of those kids went to college. And one of the key things that Molly was talking about in terms of the institutional barriers to so many families and so many individuals moving out of homelessness becomes multi-generational. And when we can really get in and address those barriers and give them access to the supports and the housing that they can afford, we break the institutional sort of intergenerational challenges for that family. And that's our goal, is to break this at those levels so that we can paint a different picture of who's struggling, and they can struggle for a shorter amount of time and just in one generation.
Thank you. Noah, is this just a money problem, or are there other problems that make this more complicated?
It's all of it. And when it comes to the money problem, I just want to lift up Valley Beth Shalom for a minute, because I was hosting that panel that Stephanie was just speaking about. And it was at Valley Beth Shalom where I met Molly Rysman for the first time when she was working for CSH, which is another service provider. And it was at Valley Beth Shalom where we decided to run a campaign around homelessness. And it was at Valley Beth Shalom where we decided to help create what became the largest housing coalition in LA County history that helped pass H and HHH. So our congregation, Eddie, has been deeply involved with this issue from the very beginning. And you're very, very lucky to have these 2 women in the study tonight, because they're 2 of the most dedicated and brilliant women on this subject that I know. So it's really great to have all of you here. This issue is so complex. It is directly correlated to funding. We know that because it's an economic and poverty issue. And it is directly correlated to racism and what we call systemic racism, which means that it's not that any one of us is particularly a racist, but the systems that we participate in have racial outcomes. We just know that they have racial outcomes. And so that means that it tends people of color have a much higher aptitude towards homelessness than let's say white folks. And that's not because you or I or anyone on this panel is racist. It's just because the system itself has these terrible racial outcomes. And we do have to talk about mental health, that we dissolved the mental health safety net in this country a few decades ago. And what's left is that people like you and I, and maybe Stephanie and Molly who are on the call with us, like if we had a brother or an uncle who was really mentally unfit, schizophrenia, for example, we could take them in and put them in our garage or put them in our back apartment, or we could take them to their appointments. We could help make sure that they're taking their medication. But if you don't have that, if you don't have a social safety net of friends or family that can take care of you, then there's no one who's going to take you to that doctor. And there's no one who's going to take you in rent-free just to take care of you. And you end up on places like Skid Row or in Hollywood Boulevard, and you're not medicated and you're sick. And that's another aspect of it. So we have to understand that mental health is also a piece of this puzzle. And yeah, so it's all of these things put together. Whether it's not just racism and it's not just mental health, but the financial piece. I can't underscore that enough, that you give someone enough money to make a home, the vast majority of well-meaning people will choose to stay in that home and live in that home and be successful in that home. The other thing I really want to dispel is this idea that when someone is homeless, they're homeless forever. That the number that we have, the 60,000 number, which just seems really daunting. I mean, when you think about it, Dodger Stadium on the second night of the World Series holds 60,000 people. So imagine that number of people in a stadium who are all sleeping sheltered or unsheltered tonight. That's a lot of people. But the vast majority of them will find their way out of homelessness at some point in the next 6 or 8 months. And that's still too long. That's way too long when it comes to being unsheltered. But the vast majority of people are not homeless permanently. There's a small group, about 19 to 24%, that are considered chronically homeless. And they're the folks who suffer the most. The people who have been homeless more than a year. They usually have a secondary or tertiary debilitating condition like an addiction or trauma or mental health issues. And that's what permanent supportive housing is trying to address. It doesn't address the mom and dad who got hard on their luck and needed a place to stay for 30 to 90 days. It addresses the people who have no social network, who physically can't take care of themselves. It's basically a rebuilding of a social safety net. And that's why I see, even if it costs a lot, it's our moral obligation. Because if someone can't physically or mentally take care of themselves, and they don't have a network of friends or family or a church or a synagogue to do that for them, to help them out, then that obligation falls on the community as a whole. So I want to just dispel that rumor that you think that someone's homeless, they're homeless for life.
I appreciate Stephanie's story about the woman that you met who ended up being saved by LA Family Housing. So, and it directs us to consider how many children are homeless in LA, and what percentage of the homeless population consists of families as opposed to lone individuals or perhaps just pairs or couples. Are there any studies of this? Do we have any notion of this?
We do, but I'm trying to look it up really quickly to give you the actual number.
No, I don't need numbers. I was
looking at you, Stephanie. I was like,
I'm like looking down my phone really fast.
What's your guess? I mean, what's ballpark?
I mean, generally we talk about, I think, roughly 20% of our homeless population being families, but that's not the exact number, which is why Stephanie's looking it up. It's not the majority of who's experiencing homelessness, but it's a really important population to look at because we do want to limit the trauma for those children. Homelessness is very traumatic. And you know, when you experience trauma like that as a child, it can have lifelong effects. And so we want to, as quickly as possible, get children out of homelessness and into a stable home. So we put a lot of special attention on what we call our family coordinated entry system to try and reduce the impacts and truly make homelessness as short as possible for those families. And LA Family Housing's one of our top leaders in our family coordinated entry system, doing incredible work.
Mm-hmm. Stephanie, did you find the statistic?
Number of homeless families.
Well, I'm interested in children too. What is being done specifically to rescue and to help and protect children who are living on the street? Because in some ways, as much as our hearts open up to the idea that anyone's living on the street, the idea that a child is living under an underpass or in a tent on the side of a freeway just completely breaks your sense of what our city's supposed to be.
So I will say that we do have it's somewhat of an unwritten policy, but a funded initiative that no child should sleep outside in LA County. So we do have a system that is really supporting families to be indoors, not sleep in their cars, but to be indoors, whether it's in, LA Family Housing has 3 different models of providing shelter, interim housing for families. One is we rent large single family homes and multiple families share that house together in a way so the kids have access to walk to school, play in a backyard, have a den where they can do homework, and the parents might share and support household duties with each other. You watch my kids today while I go for this job interview. Tomorrow, when you go to look at your apartment, I'll watch the kids and make sure they have dinner and do their homework. That's one model. A second model in supporting families is we master lease motels. So we'll take over in Pacoima. We have a 19-unit motel. So 19 families are living there. They each have their own room, but then we have a common space and we have staff on site. And that works really well because the staff is there to help the parents increase their income, search for an apartment, deal with whatever bureaucratic layers they need to get through in order to move into an apartment, as Molly was saying earlier. And then the third model, and one that we might be depending on too much, but right now it's what we have, and that is we pay for motel rooms every night. And we have probably upwards of 300 families living in hotel rooms and motel rooms every night. It's not ideal because we don't control the physical space. We're just leasing a room. And so it's not ideal, but it at least ensures that kids are indoors. LA Family Housing is working on a pilot with LA Unified School District right now, so that we're prioritizing families whose kids are enrolled in LA Unified, whose family is experiencing homelessness, really trying to layer the types of resources they need to be able to access and secure permanent housing. So in this case, it's a rental subsidy through the Housing Authority is prioritized for those families so that we are moving them quickly out of homelessness. But there is a lot of attention given to ensure that our kids, again, you want to break the cycle for that family.
Eddie, one of the things I was thinking about as Stephanie was talking, just about the number of students in LA Unified who have experienced homelessness. And the last time I looked this up was sometime late last year. So I think those numbers are a little bit old, but they're like over 17,000 students in LA Unified have experienced homelessness at some point, which is why if we do want to talk about COVID-19, one of the most heroic thing that LAUSD has done is to try to maintain its free breakfast and lunch program through drive-through pickups. Because what many people don't realize is that education is a public health benefit, but LAUSD was the largest purveyor of food assistance in the county because it would be giving away either highly subsidized or free breakfasts and lunches to family. So if you know the kids are eating breakfast and lunch, that means maybe you'll scrounge for a half a sandwich or something, but you know that your kids are being fed. And LAUSD has kept up that program, which I'm actually really proud of our district for doing that.
Before we close, I want to give you my soapbox for a moment. And I'm going to let you rant because I think that's important, especially people who care as deeply as you do. I've heard on talk radio, I've seen on Facebook, I've even heard this in more scholarly discourse, the opinion offered that the reason why LA has so many homeless people is because you give them so much stuff. You give them welfare. You give them support. If you didn't give them as much, you wouldn't have as many homeless people. In other words, it's your bleeding heart liberal kinds of generosity that's actually caused the problem. I understand that some large percentage of the national homeless population lives here. Now, it doesn't take too much imagination. I responded to the person who told me this, who happened to be a very, very intelligent person. Massachusetts has better benefits than we do. I wonder why they don't go there. Minnesota has good. But for a moment, I think it would be really helpful to hear your answer to that. Why don't we just let them all starve to death and go away? Why do we have to make us an effort as a society to help these people? What is it in us, and what is either pragmatically the reason to do this, or ethically the reason to do this? And now all of you get a soapbox, a rabbinic soapbox for the next few minutes. Who'd like to give the first sermon?
I'll jump in. I don't think it'll be a sermon. But I do just want to share the data on this. The reason we care, well, one, because these are human beings, but two, because these are our family, our friends, our neighbors. The data all shows, and it has for years, that the vast majority of people experiencing homelessness in Los Angeles have been in Los Angeles a very long time. They did not come here homeless. They did not come here to be homeless. They were either born and raised here, or they were people who came like I did for college as young adults, who came here to make a better life for themselves, because there's more economic opportunity in California than there might be in Oklahoma or Alabama. People come here because it's Hollywood, and they have dreams, and they want to make it as performers and singers and actors. People come here for all sorts of reasons. But most of the folks who are experiencing homelessness, over 75%, came here many years ago or were born here. They have a long history in LA. They were often in apartments or homes they owned and had jobs for many years before they fell on hard times. So these are our people. They're not people from other places. That's a very common narrative that people want to tell. I've done outreach before, and I'm sure Stephanie's had this experience too, where you go out and you're talking to people and you say, well, why'd you pick this spot? Well, that's where I went to elementary school, and that's where my aunt lives. I mean, they're literally people who are hyper local, that have very, very deep connections in their communities. But trauma exists everywhere, and people have a whole variety of barriers that might lead to homelessness. But these are very much our friends and neighbors. And if we changed our policies, if we don't address the root causes of homelessness, we won't change anything. You've got to look at what is causing homelessness, what is spurring this problem, what's causing thousands of people to become homeless every year. And that's what you have to focus on.
I'll jump in from there and just add, the cost of doing nothing is not zero. We spend more on crisis services in our city for people experiencing homelessness than we do on permanent supportive housing, than we do on developing housing that's accessible and affordable to families who are working and a very low income. And so just if we were to be pragmatic and take the moral tone out of this, that these are human beings, and that's why we do what we do. We do what we do because it's also fiscally responsible. That if we left people to their own devices, but yet we are not building enough housing for the amount of people that live here, whether it's your house or your house, we're just being irresponsible then. And so both from a financial perspective, and then of course, obviously a moral perspective, these are people that have been productive in societies. They are somebody's mother. They are somebody's son. They are somebody's brother. That's why we take care of them, because we take care of a whole community.
I am a rabbi, so I can give a sermon, and I'm happy to pick it up from there. No sermon. Okay, well, let me give you just one really important thing to think about. The question I think we should ask ourselves is what makes for a great city? Is it the height of our skyscrapers, the value of our art collection? Is it our ability to go to the beach and the mountains in the same day? Is that what makes a great city? Or is it about how we take care of each other? Is it how we help people who are less fortunate? Is it about how you can go to bed tonight feeling proud of yourself because you made a difference in the world? LA is the greatest cultural creation machine in the history of mankind. There are more stories written, performed, and filmed. More music is recorded here. More books are written here. More paintings are painted here than any city ever in the history of the world. So we help shape the culture of humanity. And the question I want to ask, and to ask your friend, is what kind of culture are we trying to create? One that is vicious, one that is self-centered, or one that is loving and caring and full of chesed? And choose the path. Choose the culture you want to create. Stephanie and Molly and I think have chosen ours, and your friend's welcome to choose his or hers. But I want to shape the future, one that is made of loving kindness, and not necessarily one that's made of every person for themselves.
That was beautiful. And that would have been the best way to end this conversation, except there's one more question, obviously, as a postscript, and I apologize for stepping on your beautiful ending there, Noah. And I'll ask each of her, and Molly and Stephanie particularly. COVID has forced us all to shelter in place. What happens to people who don't have a place? How has this crisis affect the homeless community, the homeless in Los Angeles, and what's being done specifically to protect them from a mass epidemic that could rip through that community?
Yeah, people who are experiencing homelessness are extraordinarily at risk for COVID. They're highly at risk because they are living outdoors where they don't have the protection of a home to protect them from people with germs. And they're highly at risk because they don't have access to being able to wash their hands and other things we do to protect ourselves. And they're incredibly at risk because when you live outdoors, it has tremendous impacts on your health. And so there are thousands and thousands of people on our sidewalks who have underlying health conditions that make them incredibly vulnerable to the virus and make the virus much more deadly for them if they get it. Thankfully, California was the first state in the country that negotiated a deal with FEMA to provide assistance to get people off the sidewalks. And so there has been a massive effort in Los Angeles. I think what people know the best is Project Room Key, which LA Family Housing is very involved in, where we identified people who are over the age of 65 or have an underlying health condition who are unsheltered. And we have been leasing hotels. We currently have 32 hotels leased so that we can get them indoors where they can be safe from the virus transmission. We have a variety of other efforts. We provide medical sheltering for people who are symptomatic or do get COVID and need a place to safely quarantine and isolate while they're sick. The city has been amazing. The mayor's office and the city council have opened a whole variety of rec centers to provide shelter for people. There's a massive effort happening around outreach, where our outreach teams are going out on the streets and doing medical screening, providing COVID tests on the sidewalk, and then returning the next day to give people their results. So there's a very big effort to try and protect people who are experiencing homelessness. Thus far, we have been lucky, and we have only seen roughly 250 cases among people experiencing homelessness, but we're still very early in this pandemic. And we have to do much more to ensure that people who are experiencing homelessness do not die from this pandemic. There's been a number of studies with some pretty dire predictions of what will happen if COVID is transmitted at a high rate for people experiencing homelessness. So this is a life-saving mission, and it's really important that people support this mission because it has deep impacts, not just for people experiencing homelessness, but also on our healthcare system. and ensuring that our hospitals don't get overwhelmed. We have seen some opposition, unfortunately, to Project Room Key, and we hope that people will understand that this is for the good of everybody, and that we have to keep our entire community healthy to keep all of us healthy.
Right now, there's Project Room Key has about 2,800 hotel rooms across the county as of this morning, and almost all of them are full. There's a little bit of a ramp-up period from once we secure a room to once it can be occupied, and that has a lot to do with health reasons and sanitation and things like that. So, and every day new hotels are coming online, which means that every day we're adding rooms. The goal is to get to as many as possible. There's no upper limit to the number of rooms that Project Room Key wants to secure. And again, it would not be possible without federal and state and county and municipal funds. Like, it's just, and everyone has chipped in, and it's been a really powerful thing to see how quickly we've been able to house so many people, which just also, again, Eddie tells me that when the will is there, when the sense of an emergency is actually in front of us, the government's willing to do almost anything to help people. And it's unfortunate that COVID is that emergency. I think that emergency hit us back in 2008 with the recession, but it's amazing to see how quickly we've been able to house just so many people and bring them out of harm's way.
And the only thing I would add to that, and it's much like what I said at the beginning, passage of Measure H 3 years ago really strengthened our homeless delivery system in LA County so that we were prepared to respond at the scale and the pace that we have in these last 2 months. So LA Family Housing alone, being our leading agency, particularly in the San Fernando Valley and Santa Clarita Valleys, we've opened up 450 of those hotel rooms in just a matter of about 3.5 weeks. And they're fully occupied, taking entire encampments, 50 people that have lived together in community as a family on the streets, moved in one day into one of those hotels. There was never an opportunity before because there was never the kind of urgency and investment to lift up that many people together at one time. And so, yes, it's sad that it took a pandemic, but we were ready and we stepped up, and we're so appreciative of you sort of sharing this story and this success in a way, because if we prove that we can do it in this crisis, it means pouring resources into solutions will get us through this.
And if people need something to cheer them up during the pandemic, because we all have our days where we feel down, quarantine isn't easy, and we know people are struggling. There are so many heroes out there every day. It's just extraordinary what people are doing. So I encourage folks to look up some of the stories, go to LA Family Housing's website, hear the amazing work that people are doing every day that is truly saving lives, and not just saving lives from COVID-19. Our real hope is that this effort will lead to a path to permanent housing for a lot of these folks that we're bringing inside. A lot of them are experiencing a shower and a bed, and being able to choose what you want to watch on television for the first time in quite a while, and it's very transformative. So it's, there is opportunity in crisis, and this is a terrible crisis, but there is also tremendous opportunity. And a lot of amazing stories out there of just incredible work people are doing. It's really been an incredible honor to be doing this work during this period and see the countless hours that people are putting in to saving people's lives.
Agreed.
Well, once again, I'd like to thank you for being part of the Rabbi Study today, this evening. And as Rabbi Noah said a moment ago, this is a struggle to decide what kind of city we're going to be, and ultimately what kind of culture we're going to shape. And you two, all three of you, are heroes in this, in that you've taken on an issue which is so difficult and so complicated and so blatantly visible to us all, and have really put your heart and souls to finding pragmatic solutions, real solutions, realistic solutions, but solutions that really touch human lives. So thank you to Molly, thank you to Stephanie, thank you to Noah, thank you for all your efforts, and thank you for being part of our conversation tonight. Take good care and stay well. And to all of our friends, take good care. We'll see you next week in the